So this is a book that I wrote after I returned to California and my parents had passed away. I thought I was writing it for one reason. I was worried about the orchard that surrounded City Hall. I knew it was protected because I remember my parents talking about that it was going to be preserved around City Hall. And when I moved back and began reading the local papers, I began reading about development plans for that property. And once there's lots to do when you're caring for your parents, and then even when they pass away, there's lots to do. But around 2011, I started going to city council meetings and discussing the challenges of that green space. And finally, we were able to beat one plan. It was dropped, but I knew it was still in the background. And I had this idea, being a journalist just about all my life, I thought I would try a longer form of journalism. I had done some previous books, but they were photo books with captions, and one was a guidebook. This time I went to the History Press and I pitched them this idea. And they did books like this about regional history. And so without really knowing a great deal about the subject, which is often what journalists do, you're given an assignment and then you have to learn about it so you can make it clear to your audience. I pitched this idea, and this is the book that I produced. And it has been nothing but a joy, this book, because people love to talk about the era of the apricots. Now, I also have learned in the years since I wrote it that there's much more to the story. So I've continued to learn about the subject. And if you're not into local history, there is also a side to it that I think is interesting, in that it's also about local entrepreneurs, because the people who owned the orchards were all business people. Each family was a business. The orchards were small, and I'll go into that as I go along. So it's several things. It's this little bit of the story of my family. It's Robin's desire to save the orchard, and it's the history of entrepreneurs. And it's about beautiful plants, interesting plants. So let's get going. This is the home that I went to after I was born. My dad built it. And so the story is about home and APRICOT's relationship to home. It's about our hometowns, APRICOTS and our hometowns. It's about our region and APRICOTS. And this is a vintage postcard of how the area was featured back when agriculture was king here. Apricots in the world, and there's a world story to do with apricots and how they came here as part of the book. And it began with my parents meeting during World War II. My dad was stationed in Spokane. My mother was a Spokane native. And boom, they got together, and my dad immediately went overseas to the last of the war in the Pacific. And he was in Okinawa for that battle, and he was there when the war ended. He was lucky, he made it home. He went to work for Cessna in Kansas. He was an aeronautical engineer. He liked the job. My mother didn't like Kansas so much. She said, let's go back to the West Coast. So he got a job with Ames Research down at Moffett. And you can see my father there in the photograph. I actually did identify him. So that's 1947, they came here. I was not born yet. And that's the year that my sister was born. Now, the challenge of World War II for people who were settling after the war is that no vehicles had been made. And you can see the old age of those vehicles. My sister doesn't like this picture because she thinks it makes her look even older. But anyway, there's my dad and my sister on the sidewalk in Palo Alto, which was the playroom, because they were only able to rent a room in a house in Palo Alto. And they wanted their own home, but they didn't think they could afford one. And they knew they couldn't build one in Palo Alto. They thought it was too expensive and there wasn't much available. So my father found a lot in Los Altos. This picture is from the winter of 47 and 48. And you know that because the trees are dormant, right? This is Covington Road over here. Behind that house there is Campbell. And the street that they built on was called Clark. It's now called Echo. It's adjacent to Parma. So if you know where that is. And he began to work on weekends to build the house himself. That's my mom. Now you can see it's spring because there are, and look at these hills above us in Los Altos Hills, all orchards. So the trees are in bloom. He's got the foundation in, and that's in the summer. You can see the trees are now in their leafy state. My sister is up on the frame in the summer of 48. And by the winter of 48, 49, the house is framed up. And once again, the trees are dormant. And this is a touching picture to me because that's my dad's shadow. He was taking the picture for his mom and dad who were back in Alabama. And that's how the home came out. So that's the home that I came home to when I was born. And I had my first photograph taken under an apricot tree. My sister beneath me, my dad holding on. And you know, when people built homes then, they often left up some of the fruit trees, which is not done so much now. But in World War II, fresh fruit was rare. My dad ate canned food for 4 years, so he was happy to leave up those trees. And the interesting thing about this story is that I knew my backyard was filled with apricots. Everybody's was in this area. But I didn't know, oh, look at that picture. Look how fruitful the trees are. My dad is, you know, propped up the branches and picking up the windfalls. But what I didn't know was why there were so many trees here. You know, as I started the book, I had to do a lot of research and it took a couple of years. That's my sister and me, because of course an apricot tree is deciduous and we're raking up the leaves. The interesting thing is how the apricot got to California, because it's not a native fruit. The one thing my sister and I talked about as we left home was everywhere else we lived, there were no apricot trees. And we couldn't quite understand why that was. In doing my book, I found some research. The primary research on the origin of stone fruits is being done at Purdue by a group of Hungarian researchers who believe that the apricot has its origins in China. And part of that was the DNA research they did. And part of it was because the first written word for apricot is in Chinese. And it goes back 3,000 years ago, I believe, to a dynasty in which they were writing about their fruits. And the pictogram for apricot is a tree with an open mouth underneath it. So if you can think of that as a descriptive for apricot, it works really well. They believe that the apricot then traveled along the Silk Road to Central Asia. My niece was in the Peace Corps in Uzbekistan, and she found them grown there for their seeds, like an almond, and they gave the fruit to the pigs. This is Armenia, where these are stamps from Armenia with the apricot on them, and that's where the Romans discovered the apricot and named it Prunus armeniaca, which is the prune out of Armenia. And from there to the Middle East and to Central Asia and Turkey and the Bosporus. And you know, most of our dried apricots today are imported from Turkey. Not all, because we still grow a lot in the United States, but you'll see a lot from Turkey. And here, look at, they're drying them just on the ground without even cutting them. In Syria, before the Civil War, and for many years, Syria was the primary origin of apricot paste, which is used in Middle Eastern food. And there is an expression that means as good as it gets in that says something like, that is so good. It's like an apricot out of Damascus. From Damascus, they went north to Egypt. And this is a vintage postcard I found that shows a man telling his son, we'll do that when the apricots get ripe. And what that means is, don't hold your breath. Apricots take a long time to ripen. And when I gave this talk to a group, one woman who had been stationed in Egypt with her husband told me that saying in Arabic. So it's apparently still used. And from North Africa they went to Spain with the Moorish invasion. And in fact, in some Latin American countries, not Spain, but in the diaspora where Spanish is spoken, the word for apricot is Damasco. So that's an interesting point. From Spain, they went to the Balearic Islands, including Majorca, where they still grow apricots today. And Majorca is the birthplace of Father Junipero Serra, who was born there in 1713 and went to Mexico after he became a priest as a professor. And from Mexico, that brings us to California, because he came to California with Portola in 1769 and brought with him, either then or on a slightly later shipment, because they got a ship about once a year from Mexico, apricot seedlings. And I found the testimony of an indigenous man who was at Mission Santa Cruz and who said his father told him that he remembered seeing the first apricot trees come in barrels with dirt in them. So they probably came on ships. And they planted them in the Mission Gardens. And we know they were there as early as 1806 because George Vancouver wrote in his journals, he was mapping the Pacific coast, and he saw them at Mission Santa Clara and in Mission San Jose in Fremont. You know, the priests used fruit for lots of things. This was not a commercial enterprise. They liked the fruit. Maybe Serra knew it from his childhood. And they made wine out of fruit because wine is used in Catholic rituals. The primary thing the missions made any money on at all, and they weren't seriously profit-making enterprises, but they made their money not on orchards, but on cattle. And this is an AP Hill photo from about 1908 that shows indigenous men as vaqueros with the cattle. Cattle were raised by the missions not for their meat, they were raised for their hides. You couldn't really preserve meat very well, but their hides were used all over the world. They were called California dollars, and they were used to make belts that drove the first machines in the Industrial Revolution. So as the world changed and California went from Spanish to Mexican to American, the first big population influx was in the gold rush. You know, there were only ever about 2,000 or 3,000 non-indigenous people in the state until the gold rush. And in the gold rush, something like 500,000 people came to California in a year and a half. And they were mostly men, and they were mostly hungry, and they just about denuded the state of game. And there was no agriculture here. So they needed to eat. And some enterprising fellows who had perhaps rolled down the hill from the gold country, unsuccessful there, looked around and saw that these trees were flourishing in the mostly abandoned mission gardens. And the first record we have of them is right about that time that they were harvested. They were harvested and taken to San Francisco for sale. Some of the people in the gold rush who weren't successful were likely farm boys. And they looked at the sky, they looked at the climate, and they looked at those trees, and an idea was born. And they began shipping trees to California and planting them. And agriculture, the fruit business was born in that way. With the advent of the Transcontinental Railway in 1869, now you had a way to ship that fruit quickly, pretty quickly. It took a week in the initial Transcontinental Railway, but the first refrigerated cars to carry fruit were developed to carry the fruit of California to the eastern seaboard. And, you know, Abraham Lincoln is the man who signed the Transcontinental Railway bill. And in Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, she says that he is reported to have said to Mary, you know, when this is all over, the Civil War, I'm going to take that train out to California. Sadly, he was not able to do that. But look at the change that happened in California from 1769, when the first people came from Latin America, to 1869. Now you have a way to move a business. And this is a photograph from 1908. More and more land now is planted in the valley in agriculture, and you have a way to transport it. You have canneries, you have label making companies, you have farm machinery companies here. It brought food and jobs to the region. These are Berryessa fruit boys in 1898. During the season, I'm told they could work as many as 80 hours a week. These aren't all boys, some of them are grown, but anybody who could work was given a job in those days in this valley, because when the fruit was ripe, it was ready. And here's just a little story about one of the people who took advantage of that opportunity. The boy with the dogs named Burrell Leonard, that I found these pictures in History San Jose. He donated these albums to History San Jose before he died, and he had labeled them. He had sat and typed labels to them, and thank goodness he did, because I was able to know more about him. His father planted that orchard just after the turn of the 20th century, and that's the orchard about World War II. So look at the size of the drying operation alone. That doesn't even count the amount they were shipping off to the canneries in Cupertino at that time. He labeled this picture as, puzzled. This is a woman from the Home Economics Department of San Jose State College, I think it was called at the time. While she's, and there's two men conferring in the background from the Department of Defense, called the War Department. And they were packing fruit for drying and canning to be shipped to the troops. During World War II, the Department of Defense, the War Department, bought up all the fruit contracts. So although the price was fixed, all of the orchardists did well, because at least there were no down years during the war. And the fresh fruit turned into canned fruit, which went to soldiers like my dad. Of course, he was happy to get fruit from California, but he never liked canned fruit after that. In any case, it was then hard for growers after the war, because there were up and down years. That's the way in the agriculture business. When you have a really good crop, you have a low price. And when you have a really high price, usually it's because there's not enough fruit to go around. So it's a cyclical business and tough. And Burrell Leonard's family continued on, but eventually decided to sell the property and develop it. And he was the developer of Valco Park. Interesting to me, however, near the end of his life, he became a philanthropist and a kind man in the valley, in addition to his development. But near the end of his life, he wasn't taking photographs of Valco and putting them in a scrapbook. He was labeling all of his orchard photographs, and I think that's telling. There were about 25,000 family orchards in this valley. There was no big ag during the prime of California's Silicon Valley, we call it Silicon Valley, Santa Clara Valley orchard era. And you may recognize some of these names. Of course, Mariani's not on there. They were one of the biggest companies. And they were in the company of processing fruit usually, but they did have orchards to grow, but most were small, 5, 10, 15 acres. The Vajotas, the Pavlinas, I went to school with the Pavlinas. Nick Vajota sprayed our trees, even though we only had a dozen trees. He had a business in the off season. The Olsons, of course, Charlie, the Vidoviches are now in the development business. So these are all names that came out of the orchard business. There was something like, if you can imagine it, this is a shot from Los Altos Hills across the valley, 200,000 acres of orchard in this valley. And imagine in spring, the different varieties, the prunes, the apricots, the almonds, the peaches, the cherries. People told me, and I learned in my research, of course, that prunes were 2 to 1 crop to apricots. So there were twice as many sold. And I always nodded and said, yes, you're absolutely right. But I never found the romance in prunes. That's why I wrote about apricots. Hundreds of packing houses. Actually, I looked up the numbers, and here are the numbers, if you can imagine. 85 canneries, 23 dried fruit processing plants, 25 frozen fruit plants, and 85 fresh fruit packing houses. So over 200, and that's just that part of the industry. There were also label making companies, as I said. FMC, Farm Machinery Corporation, had its origins in Los Gatos. Orchard Supply and Hardware came out of this valley as a co-op, and Sunsweet was a cooperative for growers. So there was a lot of innovation going on. Photograph is interesting to me because it's so multicultural. It was, as Andy Mariani has described to me, a kind of egalitarian yeoman farmer place where people helped one another work. When their crop was in, they went to work for their neighbor if their neighbor needed workers. So if you wanted a job, I mean, I'm sure it wasn't perfect, but your place of national origin was less important here. There was something like 7 million apricot trees. This is a picture of the Packard Foundation's orchard up in Los Altos Hills, I guess however many years ago. And you can see them drying there. And this is the first year that I haven't gotten the card from Mike McKinney. He sends out a card if you leave your name to tell you when the dried apricots are for sale. It's done very quietly because you're not supposed to have a business selling anything up in Los Altos Hills, but they are a foundation, so they can do it. But this year, because of the pandemic, they did not process their fruit. I'm not sure what they did with it. Anyway, that was a little bit of a disappointment. And then that brings me to the story of the orchard at City Hall, which is kind of how I started this, but the book became about the fruit, it became about my family, and it became about the history of the area. So I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about the City Hall orchard, because I had to research that too. It was built, it was planted in 1901 by Gilbert Smith, who also built that house. He was a carpenter who had worked to build dorms at Stanford to send his siblings to Stanford. And when his turn came, he went to school there for a year and said, no, you know, what I really want to do is have an orchard. And that's what he did. So the house was finished just before the earthquake in 1906. The house stood fine, but he had a windmill and it fell down. The trees, this is Gilbert Smith on a bicycle built for two. I guess the other person is taking the picture. He liked bicycles. He liked carpentry, of course, and photography. So he probably brought that camera, and it looks like they have their lunch up in the basket there. And so he worked on that orchard for 60 years. And it was big and it was beautiful, and the house he lived in until he died. But after World War II, he began to see the changes. He married late, and he and his wife had no children. This is a picture I found of El Camino Real in Mountain View. I think that's probably Magdalena El Monte intersection. I'm not quite sure, but that's the old Sloan's Furniture Warehouse, if you know where that is. And if you look up here, there's a housing development. Now, there's 5 cars, I think, on El Camino. So, you know, this was, I think it's 1951, something like that. And he was aware that the region was changing. Los Altos incorporated in 1953 and was looking for a place to build a civic center. And so at the beginning of 1954, I learned in my research, old timers said in an article in the Town Crier that I found that Frank Lloyd Wright was in the area and helped pick the site for the Los Altos Civic Center. Now, since I put that in the book, several people have asked me about it. They said, oh, I've never heard that. Why we don't know about that? So I went to the Frank Lloyd Wright archives and discovered he was in California in February 10th and 11th of 1954. So we were incorporated in December, and it was in February we began looking for a City Hall site. And we know he was at Stanford, so I went to the archives of the Palo Alto Times at the library in Palo Alto and discovered that he was on campus for lectures, but he did leave one day. It didn't say what he was going to do, but I found a picture of him at Sunset Magazine. in February 11th, 1954. So I'm going to guess he came to Los Altos that same day, because Joe Salameda, who was the city historian, said in this article that they showed him 3 sites. That's Bill Lane, by the way, with Frank Lloyd Wright. And apparently, according to the article, Frank Lloyd Wright said buy the Smith place for its beauty and its history. And that's what happened. So Smith, it took almost all year to make the deal. The deal wasn't closed till December, but he made a great deal. The deal was that the city, he kept the fruit rights of any of the trees that were left, and the city agreed to only pull out the trees as necessary. If you can believe this, this would never happen today, but only pull out the trees as necessary for the buildings. So he was able to continue growing there. However, people said that when the first trees were pulled out for City Hall, he had tears in his eyes, which I think is interesting. He lived until 1963. His wife lived until 1966. His wife lived to 1973. And then the land under their house, which they had kept, reverted to the city. And in 1978, the city turned the house, the Smith House, into the Los Altos History Museum. So it was the first museum for Los Altos. And it's the city's cultivation of the orchard and the preservation of the Smith House received this award from the county for excellence. In 1981, I discovered during the time I was going down to City Hall, I finally found the documentation to prove that the orchard had been designated as an historic landmark. Although the new city councils of the 21st century did not know this, I did find the paperwork with the help of lots of other people who also agreed that it should be preserved. And so we now know that under CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, it is a registered historic landmark. And last year, it got its first sign due to lobbying from a number of us, and we all gathered around and had a big sign picture taken. So you'll see that it's now got a name, the Los Altos Heritage Orchard. Saratoga bought the last orchard in their area when it was going to be developed. The city itself bought it in 1984. It's 13.9 acres. Ours is slightly under 10. I usually used to know the actual number, but I didn't prime up on that. Anyway, so Saratoga's is 13.9. Ours is only apricots. Theirs includes apricots and prunes. And then in the year 2000, Sunnyvale owned the land that Charlie Olson was leasing for his last apricot orchard. And Sunnyvale citizens went to the city and asked that they have that land designated as a heritage orchard, and Charlie Olson cultivates it still today. And it's really a gorgeous orchard. And he is able to, he's part of the deal is he gets to sell the fruit. I think some of it is sold by the Historical Society. All of this kind of brings me back around to my own family's orchard, which was about a dozen trees in the backyard of that first house that my dad built. And we moved from there, but not very far. My parents lived all their marriage on one street in Los Altos. My mom saw a house going up across the street, and she told my dad that that was a really beautiful house and she would like to have it, and he bought it for her. And all of my life, I thought, as I left home, that that was really a mean thing for her to have done, because he would put all this work into the house. My dad never thought of it like that at all. And I think that my dad's home was wherever she was. And as an engineer, that was just a building, which he had built with joy and abandoned. When he sold it, he made a profit on it. But I will say it must have meant something to him, because after he died, I had to clean out, you know, their house, the house, and in his sock drawer, I found this memorandum book. Well, you know, never know what's in your dad's memorandum book. I mean, it could have been girls' numbers, but he was an engineer. So inside was a catalog, a list of all of the work he had done on the house and the dates and times and the hours he had put in. You know, engineers love metrics. So he was measuring this, and he saved this book all of his life, which I thought was really interesting. And on the last page, he totaled up the hours on one of those mechanical adding machines, and the tape was in there. He spent 369 hours working on that house. He even put down if someone helped him one day, and one day my grandfather helped him. So that was interesting. I just was very moved by this because it made me realize that the structure was not as important to him as the work. And that the love of California, which he and my mother both had, you know, that was the joy, and his family. So life is about what we do, not what we own. I learned also in writing this book and researching it that every family has a story. And once again, look, we're taking a Christmas picture. It isn't Christmas yet. It's still fall. We're in our winter coats, but the leaves are just falling off the trees. And you can almost date all of our pictures, at least through the seasons, by the apricot trees in the backyard. Every family has a story. That's me, the little one, and my sister. Every story is part of history. And you in the Horticultural Society will like this picture, because that's my sister with two of the largest apricots we got when we had the orchard in the backyard. And my father discovered the whole tree produced like that year. And that was because the septic tank overflowed and it got a little bit more nutrients than usual. Every story in our families is part of our history. Our homes are our history. That's me and my dad. And history is worth preserving because we learn a lot about why we have, for example, so many entrepreneurs in this valley. And maybe their origins were in this innovative business that built what I discovered was the largest commercial fruit growing industry in the history of the world. It had never been done like this ever before to this extent. And that knowledge is worth preserving and sharing for both its heritage and, in the case of this region, for its green space, which is growing exceedingly rare as we go forward into the future. That's the story of California apricots, the lost orchards of Silicon Valley. One of my friends who's very smart believes the story is just about apricots, and that my next book after this one should be a book of recipes. And I told him I thought the story had a lot more layers than that, but if he wanted to contribute a lot of the recipes, I'm not one of the most famous cooks in our area. I'd love to do a book about apricot foods if somebody wanted to work with me on it. But instead, in the course of working on this book, I did discover 6 interesting characters, either part of the industry or on the periphery of it, that span the time from the entrance of Westerners into the California area, that go all the way through about World War I. And you can see they include Robert Louis Stevenson, Sarah Winchester, Charlie Chaplin, also Lope Inigo, an indigenous man who had a Mexican land grant ranch in Mountain View, and Chinese cannery owner, Thomas Foon Chu. It's a bunch of stories that I really like that I wasn't able to fit into the apricot book. So that came out in 2018. And there they are, both of them.